everyone, I'm Strat Tom and welcome to Stratopedia, where I look at the history behind your favourite strategy games. And we are going to be kicking off with a 7-part series looking at all of the campaigns for Total War Rome 2. We're going to be going through them in chronological order, so we start in 432 BC with the Wrath of Sparta. The Wrath of Sparta campaign places you in ancient Greece at the outset of the Peloponnesian War. Well, technically it's the outset of the Second Peloponnesian War, but the first was a rather minor conflict, so people just refer to the Second Peloponnesian War as the Peloponnesian War. So what was it all about? Well, to put it into context, the Battle of Thermopylae was in 480 BC, and the end of the Greco-Persian War was in 449 BC. So the Greeks had been without a major external threat for nearly 2 decades at this point. However, it had been close to 40 years since the Persians were actually pushed out of Greece. During that time, the unity of the Greek city-states had, as it always did, disintegrated, and they had gone back to squabbling with each other. After the breakdown of the Hellenic League, the Greek city-states started to form smaller alliances with each other. This leads us to the first major player in the war, and one of the playable factions, Athens. Athens formed a series of alliances and partnerships known as the Delian League. However, that word partnership is being used in a loose sense here, as the Delian League was dominated by Athens. The Delian League was a series of cities across Greece and the Ionian coast of Anatolia. While supposedly equals, they were undoubtedly vassals and client states to Athens. Athens became rich off the back of this, and it was able to vastly expand its fleet, making it, by far, the most dominant naval power in the Greek world. This was unacceptable to our second playable faction, Corinth. The Corinthians had previously been the dominant naval power in Greece, but now had a naval force 1/3 the size of Athens. The Corinthians, quite rightly, feared the growing dominance of the Delian League, which was looking more and more like an Athenian empire. In order to combat this growing threat, they turned to a power that had been a nominal ally of theirs and our third playable faction, Sparta. Sparta agreed that the Athenian hegemony of Greece needed to be curtailed, and so they went to war. The Spartans, the Corinthians, and a collection of smaller city-states to the northwest of Athens, and our fourth and final playable faction, the Boeotian League, formed a new alliance that would come to be known as the Peloponnesian League. With the two leagues formed, the stage was set for a showdown, and so this is where you start in the Wrath of Sparta campaign. Depending on who you choose, it is up to you to either break or cement Athenian dominance of the Greek world. So, how did it go down in real life? Well, ultimately, the Peloponnesian War was a war of specialities. The Peloponnesian League, in particular the Spartans, were excellent warriors on the land. In pitched land battles, the Athenians couldn't match their rivals, so they didn't try. Conversely, the Athenians couldn't be matched at sea, with the Athenian navy dominating the waves. So the first part of the war settled into something of a stalemate. The Spartans plundered the countryside and besieged Athens, while the Athenian navy blockaded the seas around Greece. Athens could be resupplied by the sea, and so the Spartan siege was ineffective, particularly since the Spartans faced the constant threat of revolt from the Helots, the Spartan slave class, if they were away from the city for too long. Athens would suffer at the hands of a devastating plague that would wipe out 1/3 of the population of Athens and kill Pericles, the Athenian leader. Pericles' rival for power, Cleon, would seize control of the city and would reverse the defensive posture that his predecessor had adopted. Athens had just been dealt a heavy blow, and Cleon decided that it was time to grab the bull by the horns and try to take control of this war. Ironically enough, Sparta and the rest of the Peloponnesian League were spared the spread of this plague into their lands because of the effectiveness of the Athenian naval blockade. In the Battle of Pylos, the Spartan air of invincibility would take a blow, as they were defeated. A large number of the Spartan ruling class were taken prisoner, and the Spartans had harsh terms levied on them for their safe return. Later, the Spartans would suffer at the hands of the Athenians again at the Battle of Sphacteria, during which more Spartans would shock the Greek world by surrendering. The Athenians held on to these prisoners and threatened that they would be executed if the Spartans did not leave and then stay out of the region of Attica. The Athenians could now safely move around and farm their home province. The Spartans would strike back, however, and would lead a Peloponnesian force into Thrace, occupying Delian territory there and cutting off Athens from her silver mines, dealing a huge blow to the Athenian coffers. The Athenians would attempt to retake their possessions, but would be reminded of the Spartans' prowess on the battlefield. Not only did the Athenians fail to retake the mines, but Cleon would be killed, alongside the Spartan general Brasidas. The two would settle into a peace agreement that would involve a trade of Spartan prisoners for Athenian silver. The peace would only hold for 6 years, and during that time, many skirmishes and proxy wars took place, so it's difficult to call it a peace at all. There were cities in the Peloponnesian region that had remained neutral up until this point, but the Athenians began to stir up resentment and rebellion in the region. Backed by Athens, a coalition of Peloponnesian cities led by Argos fought a battle against the Peloponnesian League. Despite early successes for the Argive coalition, the Spartans had the reputation of being the finest soldiers in the world for good reason. The coalition was defeated, and Argos and the other rebellious cities would be absorbed into the Peloponnesian League. Later, Athens would undertake an expedition to the island of Sicily in an attempt to strengthen its own position and gain a foothold in the western Mediterranean. A Sicilian ally of Athens was under attack, and the Athenians took the opportunity to expand their influence westward. Standing in their way was the powerful Greek city-state of Syracuse. Syracuse was totally independent of its mother country, but culturally was more predisposed towards the Peloponnesian cities. The campaign, to put it bluntly, was a disaster. It was a poorly run invasion which saw the Athenians procrastinate and be forced into winter quarters before achieving, well, anything of note, which allowed the Spartans plenty of time to send aid to the Syracusans. Athenian losses and setbacks would mean that they called for aid, and a large portion of the Athenian navy was sent for. The Peloponnesian War was always going to be won by the force that could best the enemy where they thought they were strongest. The Spartans were the masters of land battles, the Athenians the masters of the sea. Just off the coast of Sicily, the Peloponnesian League would deal a devastating defeat to the Athenian navy. With no navy left to extract them, the Syracusans mercilessly hunted down what remained of the Athenians on the island. Those who weren't slaughtered were enslaved. The war wasn't over yet, but Athens' empire was slipping away from it. First, a plague, and then a disastrous campaign in Italy had left Athens a much weaker force than it had once been. Athens' trump card had been its dominance of the seas, and now that was over. Back in Greece, Sparta pushed its advantage and began taking more Athenian territory. In a case of strange bedfellows, the Spartans made an alliance with their most famous foe, the Persians. A young Persian prince, Cyrus, spearheaded the Persian involvement in the conflict. He provided money and manpower to the Spartans, and in return, the Spartans backed Cyrus after his father died, and there was a dynastic struggle between Cyrus and his brother. Having the King of Kings as an ally was no bad thing. However, it wasn't just some abstract promises of assistance that prompted the Persians to get involved. As I mentioned earlier, the Delian League included a number of Greek cities on the Ionian coast of Anatolia. These had once been satrapies of the Persian Empire, and the Persians were keen to take them back. Eventually, the Spartans would take Athens, and the war would be over. The Spartans were masters of warfare. However, what they were not the masters of was diplomacy, or politics, or even a bit of tact. the Spartans took over the Athenians' Greek possessions and incorporated them into a new Spartan empire. And I am saying Spartan, not Peloponnesian here. Corinth and Sparta's other Peloponnesian allies were left wanting at the bargaining table when it came time to discuss a peace settlement. Sparta acted as if it had won the war all on its own. Certainly, the Spartans had been the leaders, and the war could not have been won without them, but to cut out everyone else entirely, it created no small amount of resentment. Not only this, but the Spartan system was not conducive to the ruling of an empire. The Spartan army was filled exclusively with Spartan citizens, with all other jobs being done by the helots. The Spartan army could easily defend Laconia and keep the helots in check when the entire army was at home. But issues arose when that same army was spread thin, keeping watch over all of Greece. To the other Greeks, the Spartans were a bizarre lot. Their devotion to the military at the expense of all else was strange to the Greeks. These weird Spartans were fine when they were down there on the south coast, and they were great when Persia had threatened their independence. But when they expected all Greece to bow to them, it was too much. The new Spartan Empire collapsed in on itself almost as quickly as it had been formed. The puppet rulers of Athens would be overthrown and Athenian democracy would be restored. The irony is that if the Greek cities had been united under a single ruler, then perhaps a few decades later they would have been able to effectively resist Philip II of Macedon. But they weren't. Philip brought all of Greece, with the exception of the Spartans who were deemed to be more trouble than they were worth, under Macedonian hegemony. This Macedonian-ruled Greece would be inherited by Philip's son, Alexander. And when he became king, Alexander lived out his days in peaceful anonymity and did nothing of note. So the question is, how good is the Wrath of Sparta as an authentic representation of the Peloponnesian War? Well, I guess it's okay. The map that is used is just of Greece and the Ionian coast of Anatolia, and so this allows for a much more detailed map than is available in the base game. It's a better reflection of the wide variety of different Greek city-states that were all separate and independent during this time. One little detail that I noticed that I really did love was the design of the Athenian walls. I mentioned earlier that Athens could be resupplied by sea. This was done by having a main wall surrounding the city of Athens, but then having a series of perpendicular walls that ran all the way to the coast and to the harbour. It was a fairly unique design and it has been recreated on the Wrath of Sparta map, which I actually really like. However, it is a game and we can't expect it to be a truly authentic representation of the war. Obviously, game makers have limitations on them, so I can't expect too much. However, there are a couple of things I would like to point out that I think was within their ability to change. First of all is the representation of the Phalanx Formation whilst on the battlefield map. Greek warfare really was all about maintaining the line, maintaining the shield wall of the phalanx. In Total War Rome 2, we see groups of units about 120 strong or so being commanded and moved around the map individually. This is an excellent representation of the Roman maniple system and was actually one of its biggest successes. The maniple system would eventually defeat the Greek phalanxes because of this maneuverability and this flexibility when put next to the incredibly immobile Greek phalanx. I for one would like to see a more authentic representation of Greek warfare when it comes to trying to either outflank or break the shield wall and break through the phalanx, which would have been the historical objective of any Greek commander. As it is, these individual units go off on their own, they fight on their own, and it's just not a proper representation of how a phalanx would fight and operate. The second and last thing I want to mention is the Persian involvement in the game. Now, in the Wrath of Sparta, the Persians just sit on the edge of the map waiting menacingly until the end game. What we see happen in the Wrath of Sparta is the Persians will see who is the more dominant force out of either the Athenians or the Spartans, and then they will side with their enemies against them. I understand the logic of this from a gameplay perspective. The game developers wanted to put some endgame challenge in there, and that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. However, earlier we discussed how and why the Persians sided with the Spartans. One of the main reasons the Persians sided against the Athenians with the Spartans was the territorial gains that they could make on the Ionian coast. It makes no sense to me as to why the game would put you in a position where the Persians would side with the Athenians, despite the fact that they controlled lands that the Persians clearly wanted and that the Athenians had previously taken from them. Anyway, that about wraps it up here. Personally, I think the Wrath of Sparta is a pretty good bit of DLC. If you enjoy Rome 2, then I would definitely say you would enjoy this too. I hope that you will join me next time when we will be looking at the titular Romans for the first time in the Rise of the Republic campaign. Until then, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I've been Strat Tom, and I'll see you next time.